Sadguru, can you tell us more about what's happening in Kailash and Manosarova? Are they linked in any way?
The very first time we went there, when I noticed what was happening, and the phenomena of Kailash so close by, these two things cannot be unconnected, that was clear to me. There is no ways two such phenomenal events to be unconnected with each other and so close. But we didn't really make the connection as to what. As we have said a few times, there's a phenomenal activity going on in the lake. Kind of life forms which don't… not the kind of life that we know as life here. Definitely life, no question about that, but not the way we know life. Here, this part of the creation of which we are a part, life happens in a certain way. What we call as life energies are in a certain way. Whether it's an ant or an elephant, or a monkey or a man, the essential nature of the way life happens here is same. How it manifests itself in any number of forms, but the essential nature is same. But this is not that kind of life, it's totally different kind of life. Normally, here we could classify life, on one level we could classify life as conscious part of life and unconscious part of life. But with these life forms, we don't know where to put them, because these seem to be totally unconscious, but they are conscious. They seem to be in bunches, but they're individual. They're individuals which bunched up together, maybe just for this journey, or maybe that's how they exist, we don't know for sure. But they have an individuality. At the same time, they are in bunches, which makes them all like one piece. These things don't happen here. Here, if you create an individual life form, it becomes individual. If you fuse something, it'll never remain as two, it'll become as one. Here we cannot fuse something and keep it individual. In this life, it doesn't happen like that. It is like you ate a banana, the banana becomes a part of you, the banana doesn't exist anymore, only you are. But now you ate a banana, it's become a part of you, but still it's a banana. That doesn't make sense, the way we know life. But that's how it is with what we see in Manosarova. It doesn't stand to our logic and our understanding and our perception of life. So, definitely they don't belong to the earth, there's no question about that. And such a phenomenal amount of activity of in and out of the lake. For what purpose? We are not 100% sure. We're beginning to have some inkling. We need to spend more time on this, at least we have some fundamentals towards it now. And the Kailash, when we say Kailash, going by the legend, going by the mythological legends in this country, Kailash is… we are not… when we say Kailash, we are not talking about a mountain. We are talking about a space which is beyond, somewhere. Generally we say, if somebody died, we say he went to Kailash. That means he went to Shiva's abode somewhere, wherever that is. The same name was given to the mountain because that is also referred to as Shiva's abode. So Shiva's abode on this planet is referred to be as Kailash. We inferred because his knowing is stored there. That is why we refer to it that way. But there seems to be much more to it. For those of you who saw it, you clearly saw that the nature of that mountain and the surrounding mountains is very, very different. Clearly, distinctly, even for a layperson, it is distinctly visible to see. This is almost steel-like, it's like almost metallic kind of stone. Rest of it is all brown, like mortar. When I say mortar, it is like molten soil. Soil has melted, but the rock has not melted. So you see huge brown mountains with all pebbles and rocks sticking in it. It looks like concrete, like man-made concrete, because the soil has melted and the rock has not melted. If the soil has not melted and rock has not melted, for some reason, for whatever reason, the temperatures must have hit somewhere between 800 to 1100 degrees centigrade. Then the soil melts and the rock won't melt. If temperature crosses 12 to 1400 degrees, the rock will also melt. So something happened there which took the temperatures between 800 to 1100. If a volcano happened, the temperatures will be way beyond. The rock melts and flows. That's what you call as lava or whatever, it's molten rock. If a meteorite landed, the temperatures usually touch 3000 to 4000 degrees centigrade, everything melts and there should be a huge crater. Such a thing didn't happen. So the theory could be that something landed but managed to land gently and created only 800 to 1000 degrees, where the soil melted but the rock did not melt. Or somebody managed to land a huge mountain of a meteorite gently. If somebody managed to land a meteorite gently, that's something else. Coming to Shiva himself, one thing about Shiva is, whatever, there are 1000 stories describing his life, but there is not a single story about his childhood or about his old age. He had no parents and no grave. There's a beautiful story which says, when Shiva was to marry Parvati, what's her father's name? I'm sorry. Himavat, yes. Himavat was a king, did not approve of this alliance because Shiva had hideous friends around him. Always Shiva's friends were described as demons, as goblins, as demented and deformed beings. So somebody will look demented and deformed to you if they don't look like you. You have two hands like this. Suppose you see a man who comes with a, boneless hand, like a snake, snake has a bone inside, but let's say not jointed like this. See, if you had a totally flexible snake-like hand, it would be so much more useful. Just imagine with how much, without any effort, you would do all your asanas. Isn't it? If your body was flexible enough, at least your hands and legs were flexible enough, like that of a snake, you could do any asana just like that. Wonderful yoga you would do. Suppose a man comes with that kind of hands, not just two, one is growing out of his head. You would think he's some kind of a freak and a demented being and distorted and whatever. He's not distorted, he's just different. These two hands which have grown out of our shoulders, this is not good technology, see? It doesn't bend beyond this. I've been doing my asanas, but still, this is all it bends. This won't bend like this, only this. Not very good technology. This was like a snake, you know? Just imagine. And this is growing out of shoulders, you have to use your head as to how this hand should function. If a hand was growing out of your head, definitely it would be a more intelligent hand. We could expect more sensible action out of you. But you would call such a person as a deformed being. So, there were people around Shiva all the time. His friends were always deformed beings. No, they were just different. They just were different. They were different because they didn't belong to this planet anyway, they came with him. Only he took on the human form. The stories clearly say that only sometimes he was a Sundaramurti, that means he was a very handsome, wonderful man. Otherwise, he was also a hideous being. So sometimes he took on the form of a wonderful, absolutely resplendent human form. Otherwise, sometimes he was also like that. And there are not a single story of suggesting anything about his childhood, not a single story about his old age or death or grave or parentage. It is clearly said that he has no parents. No father is understood, no mother is not understood by anybody, isn't it? Because he didn't belong here. He came from elsewhere, his friends hung around him, and he came and went, always repeatedly the stories. Just 2 days ago was Vinayak Chaturthi, did you know, all of you? Vinayaka means the Ganapati. You know Ganapati, the elephant-headed god, that was his festival 2 days ago. That was the day his head was chopped and he got an elephant head. This happened because Shiva left Parvati on the banks of Manosaravar and disappeared for over 10 years or more maybe. He went away, which he was doing very constantly. He was here for a while and he was gone. When he was gone, Parvati just being alone, she wanted to have a child, and there is a curse that she can never have a child. You need to understand, Shiva never fathered any child. And the stories clearly say, no woman could hold his semen in her womb because he was not human. So Parvati could never have a child, she knew that. So she took sandal paste, made the form of a little child and breathed life into it through the tantric process. This child became alive and she fed and brought up this child. This boy became 10 years of age. 10, 11 or 12 years of age, around that kind, a young boy. And he was guarding Parvati. Parvati was having bath. She said, don't let anybody this side, whoever comes, stop them. Shiva was gone for 10, 12 years and he came back. When the boy tried to stop him, he got angry and chopped his head off. That means he was away for 10, 12 years' time. Every time he went away, all these other people who were with him, who were distorted or different people, they were all gone. When he came back, they all came. And there's another story how Kartikeya was born. Kartikeya means Subramanya or Muruga was born. Once again it is said, because Shiva was made in such a way that he could not impregnate or have his child, and people had the desire to see that someone like this becomes alive, he dropped his semen into the sacrificial fire, into a homa. And from that it was taken, and 6 apsaras, apsaras means women who are not human, who come from elsewhere, took this and they couldn't hold it, and 3-month-old babies they delivered. And these 3-month-old fetuses were kept in lotus leaves and nurtured, and then Parvati merged all the 6 and made them into one. This is how the story goes. All these things suggest that he came from elsewhere, did what he wanted to do and went back, and periodically he went and came at different times. This could have happened over many thousand years, still coming and going, still coming and going. In the Shiva Sutra, one of the shlokas says, refers to Shiva as Yaksha Swarupa. Yaksha means an alien being. This culture is full of such stories, how these beings visited this planet. They are referring to Shiva as a Yaksha, that means he came from outside. This is the first reference I saw, a direct reference where it says Shiva is an Yaksha Swarupa, he is not human. So, when we went to Manosharovar this time, the moment I went there, I felt such a tug. It was like literally these beings were just after my ring finger. They were just going at my ring finger with so much force and so much doggedly going at it. And as far as I know, because I know this life, the way we know it, is constructed in such a way that there's enormous significance to the ring finger. I don't believe that other lives could be made the same way. The whole system of yoga understood the significance of how to master the ring finger. This is like your master key to the cosmos. If you want to open up the whole cosmic process, you can open it up with this ring finger. They were going for this, that means either they know about it, or they sensed it, or it is from them that we know all this, whichever way it is. But they were not ignorant of it. They know our ways, or they taught us these ways, or they made us this way. We don't know how much role they have played in our making, but definitely the impact of what he did and the whole science of yoga that he propounded didn't come from here. There was a deeper understanding elsewhere and it was just brought to us. He came at a certain time as a youth and he left as a youth. He was not born here, nor did he die here.